hello. You're back. Did you read the book? I hope you read the book because it was Jane Austen. And so if you can't manage a Jane Austen, well, I don't know. We're going to be talking today about Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. So very famous book, very nice little film from the 1990s with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet and Alan Rickman. Got to say, I enjoyed the book a lot more after I got Alan Rickman into my head. Just saying. No, I'm not a Willoughby. I really like Colonel Brandon. But anyway, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. We're not just going to talk about Sense and Sensibility. I'm not doing all of Austen. That's the first thing I'm going to say. I'm not going to be doing all of Austen. We will touch on P&P. We're not going to do a whole video on P&P because everybody does Pride and Prejudice. There is so much content about Pride and Prejudice out there that while we will talk about that a little in terms of giving a bit of context for the entire world of Austen that she produces, we're not actually going to read Pride and Prejudice. So we've read Sense and Sensibility. Sense and Sensibility is one of Austen's earliest novels. I think it might be her first. I'm not 100% certain, but I do know that she wrote it in the 1790s. So it is a very early novel for her. And we're doing Jane Austen because Jane Austen is, well, Jane Austen, but she's also very, very important in that she is the mother of what we would consider romance as a genre. There are romances in the 18th century. There are plenty of romantic stories, but romance as a genre that follows courtship and ends up with, and then they got married and lived happily ever after, does really begin with Austen. There are other novels which have romantic subplots that end with a marriage, but the actual courtship is often not the sole focus of the novel. Tom Jones has Tom and Sophia's courtship in there, but a great deal of the novel is taken up with our going and following Tom on the road, following Sophia on the road, avoiding Mr. Bliffle. We don't have that really strong focus on courtship and the importance of courtship and the logistics of courtship that you get with Jane Austen. So Sense and Sensibility follows the Dashwood sisters, Eleanor and Marianne. Eleanor is in love with Edward Ferrars, who is the brother of her brother's wife. And for much of the novel, Marianne is in love with Willoughby, who is a cad. He is a dissolute figure. He is a seducer. So we've met seducers before in 18th century literature, but Willoughby is a little different to them. She is also loved by Colonel Brandon, who is an older gentleman. When I say older, he's 35. That's not old. That's old. That's younger than I am. He's 35. So he's not an old man. But if you're 17, he looks like an old man compared to the 24-year-olds of Willoughby and Edward Ferrars, who are very young. That is actually one of the big things in this book that you don't see so much in the more famous Pride and Prejudice. And I say Pride and Prejudice is more famous. Pride and Prejudice has more of an impact on where the romantic novel will lead. Darcy and Elizabeth are really a blueprint for the romantic novel. There are three really important novels for the development of romantic literature, one of which is from this period, one of which is Jane Austen, which is Pride and Prejudice. The other is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Both of those give us different levels of the romance genre that we are familiar with, but Pride and Prejudice gives us a blueprint, which we don't get in Sense and Sensibility. And one of the biggest differences between Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility is Darcy's father is dead. Darcy's father is dead, and he is the inheritor and the sole proprietor of Pemberley and the estates. And Darcy is fantastically wealthy. Mrs. Bennet says he has 10,000 a year. Now, to put that into context, £1,000 is the equivalent today of £50,000, which is in Australian money about $150,000. So an income of £1,000 is about $150,000. Mr. Darcy's 10,000 a year is a yearly income of $1.5 million today. Okay? Huge. I think I've got my maths right. But $1.5 million. He is fantastically wealthy. He is a 1%er. Nobody ever asks where his $1.5 million a year comes from. And given that this is a time of slavery, given this is a time of the colonies, I don't think it kind of bursts our little romantic bubble if we start asking how a single person can have an income of $1.5 million per year. It's very, there's probably some really mucky things in there. It's not just from the tenants on his estate. It's not. There's probably sugar money from the Caribbean. There is possibly money from the colonies in Canada or America. There is possibly even slave money in there. It is fantastic amounts of money. So, Mr. Darcy is the prototype of the fabulously wealthy man that you find in romance novels. It's also, where you get the Christian Greys and the Edward Cullens of 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight and all that garbage. Ugh. So they're always rich. That is one thing that we are saying about romance, the romance genre, is they are always rich men because of Pride and Prejudice, because of Mr. Darcy and his fabulous wealth. Okay, so actually, when you look at it, Bingley and Jane have a more 18th century courtship. We see very little of it. He's pretty and rich and she's pretty and agreeable, and so they fall in love and then only have to overcome the certain obstacles before they can marry and live happily ever after. It's uncomplicated. The idea of having a complicated courtship is something that Jane Austen brings into this genre. So Willoughby is a cad, and Marianne does not think much of Colonel Brandon as a suitor because he is 35 and she is 17, and she has very fixed ideas of sentimentality, and he doesn't fit within her romantic ideals. Eleanor is in love with Edward, but Edward is engaged foolishly at 19. He became engaged to Lucy Steele, and they've been engaged for 5 years. And he has, in those 5 years, come to regret it, but he cannot get out of his engagement without her releasing him. So we start to see in Sense and Sensibility the mechanics of engagement. Okay, Marianne is waiting for Willoughby to propose to her so that she can say yes. She has been led to believe that he will, that they are on intimate terms, but he never actually proposes. She can't propose to him. She can only say yes or no. And when he's about to propose, it all comes out that he has seduced Colonel Brandon's ward, got her pregnant, and he's going to lose his potential fortune if he doesn't marry her, which he doesn't. So he then goes and leaves Marianne, who he had intended just to play with. He hadn't expected to fall in love with her, and dumps her for a wealthy woman who has a huge fortune in order to secure his fortune. This is where we discover how much family has to do with fortune. Darcy is very particular because he has no family to oppose it. There's Lady Catherine de Bourgh, but quite frankly, he has enough of his own fortune to be entirely independent, and he's clearly over the age of 25. Being over the age of 25 means he has full legal majority. There is not another person who can come and interpose their will on him. Although you have majority at 21, so you can do certain things, there are other things that it takes until you are 25, like being allowed to marry without parental permission, having full control of one's finances, that do not happen until one is over 25, if you're a man. And so Darcy is clearly old enough to not actually need Lady Catherine de Bourgh's permission to marry. So it gives him freedom. However, Edward Ferrars needs his mother's permission. His mother, he hasn't got control of his own finances. His mother does. His mother does not approve of his marriage either. Engagement, though she's more lenient towards his engagement to Eleanor because she is of good family, rather than his engagement to Lucy Steele, which was set to ruin him entirely until she runs off with his brother, who is more easily forgiven than Edward. But it allows for the romantic ending of the book. So you have so much into finances. There is so much talked about money. Last month's video, we talked about the fact that there was a lot of talk about money and wealth because that was a focus of Goldsmith. Jane Austen also talks about money and wealth enormously, and she talks about being poor on, $500 a year. £500 a year, okay? They're poor. They have servants. £500 a year, by our calculations of before, gives them $75,000 a year. Yes, it's not that upper crust income. Sure, you might be hanging on to that world by your toes, but you're not poor. If you can afford a house with servants, you are not poor. You just don't have to go out to work. That's the thing. These incomes are passive incomes. They are unearned incomes. And because they are unearned incomes, which is very important for women, they're not allowed to really do much in the way of earning. You can go and become a schoolmistress, or you can become a lady's companion, neither of which is a particularly valued or well paid, frankly, job. So they are reliant on this passive income, and they are reliant on the men in their families looking after them. Mr. Bennet is generally seen as quite sympathetic. Mrs. Bennet gets a lot of flack for trying to marry off her 5 daughters to the richest men she possibly can. But she's forced into that situation by the fact that Mr. Bennet has been an incredibly lax financial manager. He has done nothing to provide for his daughters properly. He has done nothing to increase his income, because a gentleman doesn't work. But he has not managed his finances well. Not well enough for a man with 5 daughters who need to marry in order to retain their position. So his estate is entailed. So he has done very badly by his daughters. He is always seen as this benign figure, but he has frankly sat in his library for 23 years reading his books, doing bubkas for his girls. So, yeah. So before you go complaining that Mrs. Bennet is a hysteric, Mrs. Bennet is having a perfectly reasonable reaction to the fact that she has a 23-year-old daughter, a 20-year-old daughter, and 2 more between those 2 ages and 15, which is her youngest daughter, and none of them are married, and there are no suitors, and this is not good at all. And God forbid Mr. Bennet dies, because then they're all out on the street, because Mr. Collins will take the estate, and then they are left in absolute poverty. They will be reliant on her brother, because the Gardiners are well off, but they're not part of, although they are well off, they are not, he's not a gentleman. Mrs. Bennet is not from the same class. So it would drop her daughters down in their ability to marry well, because they would be associated with a man in trade. So the whole world of Austen is so mercantile. And it's mercantile for a reason. So back to Sense and Sensibility, the other thing that I really think is fascinating about this book is, and what Jane Austen does, Jane Austen creates romantic heroes who are introverted, which is very, very different from later romantic heroes. Mr. Darcy is not an asshole. Mr. Darcy is deeply, deeply introverted, and we know this from the text. He doesn't like strangers. He doesn't like crowds. He's really bad until you get to know him. But when she visits Pemberley, his servants love him. He's relaxed. He's able to talk, and he's able to talk to the Gardiners about something that he likes, which is his home. And he has his sister around, so he has that familiarity and is able to be an appropriate brother to her in terms of be the host. He's more comfortable in his own surroundings than other people's surroundings. This is like classic introvert. Colonel Brandon is very introverted. Yes, he's seen to have a gloomy temper, but he's also at home. He is also quite quiet, quite thoughtful. But he's not a person who is just incapable of doing something to help. He's going to be the first person who helps. He's very, very generous. He's very hard to get to know. You're not going to find these things out unless he decides to tell you, which is a really introverted thing. He actually turns out to be a very open book when he is willing to share. He shares this huge story of Eliza Brandon, his cousin, who he was in love with, who Marianne reminds him of. He is incredibly introverted, which is a really different sort of hero to what we're used to. Edward Ferrars is awkward and shy from the outset. And it turns out that he is very mismatched with Lucy Steele, who, as the book goes on, you realise how bold and brash and, frankly, completely indiscreet the girl is. Whereas Eleanor is much better suited to him. I mean, his great ambition is to join the church and have a parsonage, which he ends up having courtesy of Colonel Brandon. They are very, very introverted people. She has often very extroverted heroines. So her heroines are dynamic because they're the ones we spend a lot of time with. But her heroes are very introverted. Her seducers are extroverted. Her seducers are extroverted. Her side characters are extroverted. So Mr. Bingley is very extroverted, which is why he has no trouble securing Jane. But her heroes are very introverted. And this introversion of her heroes gets a little bit confused with the later heroes of someone like Rochester or Heathcliff, who aren't introverted, they're assholes. Okay? One has his wife locked up in the attic, and the other one is, well, he's Heathcliff. He marries and torments his wife to death because she's not Cathy. Well, frankly, you're an asshole. Both of them. I don't know what the Brontes did, what happened to the Brontes, but frankly, their choices of men are like, wow, do you know how to pick them? They're assholes. And unfortunately, for romantic literature, which you see in something like Twilight, which has suckered in so many people, the introverted hero of Jane Austen has been confused with the complete assholery of the Brontes. And so you end up with, oh, Edward, he's so vague and mysterious. That's like, no, he's an asshole, honey. Leave him alone. He's not introverted. This is why the turn with Darcy is so strong, because what we think we know about Darcy is we're strangers and he doesn't perform well to strangers, and he says so. But once we know him as a character, once we know what he really is like, it's not that he suddenly changed and became nice. No, he's still going to be really cripplingly awkward among strangers. He is still going to be awful among strangers. But what he does for Lydia, what he does with Wickham, what he does for Elizabeth, which he says, it was all for you. It was all for you. That is very much him. He didn't change. He just showed a different side of himself, which is completely different to Rochester. Rochester is an asshole. You would absolutely not marry someone who has their former wife locked in the attics, even after she's dead. Even after she's dead, that is not a safe man. That is toxic. That is scary. Heathcliff, oh God, don't even bother with Heathcliff. He is just, yes. So it means that people have misread a lot of Austen's heroes in light of these later heroes, but her heroes are definitely introverted. Colonel Brandon is certainly introverted. His shyness around Marianne, his willingness to open up, his unwillingness to even offer Edward Ferrars a living, but to give it through Eleanor, because he doesn't know the man well enough, is very, very introverted. So that's our little chat about Jane Austen. I know we're talking Sense and Sensibility, but we're sort of ranging across because Jane Austen is so important as the originator of what we now consider as the romance genre. Next month, we are staying in the very, very late Georgian period, but we are starting another little holiday. We are going to Scotland. We are going to Scotland, and we are starting our Scottish holiday with Sir Walter Scott's The Bride of Lammermoor. So another late Georgian. and I will see you then. So, goodbye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books, writing courses, and other materials to help with your writing.